Why is addiction such a stigmatized mental illness?
Addiction is one of the most common mental illnesses, with about 21% of people in Canada meeting the criteria for addiction in their lifetime. It's a chronic and complex disease that is often made more difficult to recognize and treat because of the intense stigma associated with it. That stigma is pervasive because we still tend to view addiction as a choice that someone makes for themselves. And our history of treating addiction as a criminal justice issue instead of a public health concern reinforces the idea that addiction is something that deserves to be punished. While that perception is changing, we're still a long way from thinking about addiction as an illness that's deserving of support and treatable like any other mental illness. Let's start with the basics. Addiction is a treatable illness that involves complex interactions in brain circuits, genetic background, environment, and personal experiences. A person can experience an addiction to a substance like alcohol, nicotine, or opioids. Or they can experience an addiction to a behavior like gaming, gambling, or sex. To help understand when use of a substance or behavior becomes problematic, we can use the 4 C's: compulsion, craving, consequences, and control. Compulsion is when someone has an overpowering urge to perform a specific action that fuels their addiction. It's an intense feeling that can overwhelm the person experiencing it. Cravings mimic physical needs like hunger or thirst. It can become so intense that it causes insomnia or a lack of appetite. People experiencing cravings can become anxious and agitated and unable to think of anything but getting relief. Consequences of addiction are often devastating. Addiction can harm a person's physical, mental, emotional, financial, social, and professional health. Continuing to be involved with a substance or behavior despite those consequences is a sign that someone is experiencing an addiction. The final C is control, or rather, the loss of it. Over time, people experiencing an addiction can lose their ability to exercise restraint with a certain substance or behavior, and their addiction can spiral. And that's the real kicker. Addiction is often framed in terms of control, that people choose to use a substance or practice a behavior. At a certain point, the brain of someone dealing with an addiction can make the person feel like that substance or behavior is necessary for their survival.
Which is why changing a relationship to a substance or a behavior can be a grueling experience, not only physically, but psychologically.
Let's unpack that a little more.
I work with a lot of young people where I would say the majority of young people in my practice, their substance use is because of their trauma.
It's also common for addiction to coexist with another mental illness. It's estimated that at least half of people who live with an addiction also have another mental illness. And it's common for people to develop an addiction as a way of coping with that underlying mental health condition.
If you're treating someone for an addiction, that oftentimes that addiction doesn't exist in isolation. And that if someone is using to ease feelings of like depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, there's often a need to deal with like the underlying cause as well as like the negative repercussions from the substance use.
It's a complicated and exhausting process, and one that requires the right kind of professional, emotional, and societal support for there to be positive growth. That support isn't as widespread as it needs to be. Treatment centers can be difficult to reach, especially for those in rural and remote areas of the country. They're often incredibly expensive, and they might not be culturally sensitive or appropriate.
And for those dealing with an addiction to an illegal substance, they are often treated harshly by our financial, social, and justice systems, which make it so much harder for them to access the treatment they need for their addiction, and can cause psychological harm to the person in the process.
That needs to change if we're going to get support for the nearly 6 million people in our country who deal with addiction in their lifetime. We need to understand that people who live with addictions need our support, our empathy, and resources to help manage them. We need policies that support people who live with addiction and the people around them who help them do it. Fundamentally, we need to start treating addiction like we would any other illness. And failing to support people dealing with an addiction is a societal failure that can no longer be pushed aside.